hello, and welcome to an unexpected art lesson, the show where we talk about all the things you didn't know about art. I'm one of your hosts, Brianna Jean.
Well, hello there. I am Watson Ash. I have a knowledge of art history thanks to the local university before my exile from there, as well as a fascination with how the older Renaissance and Neoclassicism artists have an influence in modern media, including gaming and cinematic universes.
Several months ago, we had a very brief conversation where he just started talking about art, and at the end of it, I was like, hey, do you want to do a podcast where we just talk about this? Because there was so much that I didn't know, not claiming to be an expert by any stretch of the terms, but it's just, there's a lot of interesting stories out there and interesting ways that art interacts with real life. So we decided to do this show, and we are starting with a bit of a deep dive into Hieronymous Bosch.
I have had a history with exploring various galleries across the world, doing write-ups for various educational facilities. Ironically enough, none of the ones at the university I actually studied at, but that's neither here nor there. But one thing I was always fascinated by is how certain artists, such as Bosch, would be seen as a precursor to influences to much larger things such as H.R. Geiger, even the Aliens universe, especially with how the reality that is portrayed there of this cold steel, but with a unique organic influence, would create these worlds that are both alien and familiar. And the one artist I believe really does encompass that would be Bosch.
Yeah, I still need to watch the Alien movies. I will admit that's something that I've fallen behind on, and I need to fix that.
I had a pet rabbit that loved to do the facehugger routine to anything that got a little too close to him that was on his level, so I kind of summarized my Alien experience through that.
Yeah, fair enough. My experience with Bosch mostly comes from the TV show, which is a good TV show, and at one point I do believe there is, I think it's like a serial killer or something that is trying to call out Harry Bosch using their references to the Garden of Earthly Delights.
Which, ironically enough, we are talking about it today.
That we are, but first, so why don't you tell us a little bit about Bosch, where he's from, and what's his story?
Alright, well, I figure we'll start off talking about Bosch with kind of a idea of his experiences and how he viewed the world. So, imagine walking through a medieval European town. Streets are narrow, the buildings kind of lean inward like tired old men, and everywhere you look, religion and superstition blend together in this weird kind of mixture of daily life. This would be the town of, and I'm going to fail at pronouncing this correctly because it is a weird name. S. Hertogenbosch, Netherlands, in the late 1400s, and in one of these leaning buildings, an artist is creating visions that will both haunt and inspire creators for the next, well, we got 500 years so far, but considering the nightmare fuel he creates, I'm sure it's going to keep going for a lot longer. The one thing that really helps Hieronymus Bosch define himself in that particular era and inspire artists going forward is that he did paint religious scenes, but it wasn't just that. He painted these more surreal worlds where, well, as you mentioned earlier, fish fly through the air, musical instruments become torture devices, and hybrid creatures perform acts that defy daily explanation. Bosch himself was born around 1450. He emerged during a time where artists mostly were focused on creating beautiful, idealized religious works, which, again, they have their own merit in that particular time frame. Instead, though, he kind of went a different route, and instead of these flawless figures and perfect realized beauty, he went to more nightmare fuel and the darkest corners of human imagination.
Sounds like he took everything that was going on at that time, everything that was expected, and decided, hey, I'm going to make it weird. which surreal is a good description for the art that I am looking at right now, and it's almost like whimsical horror. It's very whimsical nightmare fuel.
I like that. Whimsical nightmare fuel. That should be the tagline for this episode.
It might be.
And that does bring about a great kind of point of what Bosch was about. To understand him, you need to understand that particular time frame. This was the late medieval period, which was a time of intense religious fervor, but there were undercurrents of a desire for societal change. This is the time that the Black Death had just ravaged Europe. Well, it was a century before that, but still the Black Death still had hung over everybody. And it had left these deep scars and kind of lasting memories among those who survived. At this particular time, the church's influence was absolute, but there were questions greater than what the church could answer starting to emerge. And of course, in this particular environment, Bosch had created this art that was both deeply religious and kind of interestingly subversive.
Yeah, it goes against what people are talking about. It is always interesting to see how it repeats throughout history, that whenever something like a plague or natural disaster happens, the echoes of that has an impact all over, not just in the daily lives, but in the art and media that's created during those times, as we have experienced ourselves. And also the way that oftentimes the church does play a role or take a bigger part in the broader scheme of things afterwards, even if it doesn't have all the answers. People kind of go back to leaning on faith and try and make sense of what all they're dealing with through art.
I would completely believe that if anybody was trying to make sense of faith through Bosch, I have many, many more questions for them. But interestingly enough, he was part of a rather large religious art movement, but while still conveying his subversive kind of ideals through this, especially since Bosch actually does come from a pedigree of painters. Hieronymus actually is also one of the first artists who adopted a moniker. He took his name from the hometown of S. Hurtenbosch. His grandfather, father, and his uncles were all artists. However, they were more or less erased to time, while his vision was something that made him more of a lasting influence. He does hail from the religious Brotherhood of Our Lady. And for anybody who has played Bloodborne, I'm pretty sure you can guess a few of the references on that alone. But this does actually grant Bosch access to a much larger library of religious texts, as well as wealthy patrons, which did give him the opportunity to explore art in a much different way than other members of his family were able to, and thus kind of created a more interesting and more lasting impression with some of his major pieces.
I can definitely see that. I do remember coming across that religious order in my research, but I will admit I don't know much about it. I am curious to know more about it, but it's not one I'm familiar with.
Let me just pull up my references on the order of the Brotherhood of Our Lady. And interestingly enough, this was one of the reasons that I start making actually notes on where everything is found in my notes. The illustrious Brotherhood of Our Blessed Lady, also known as the Illustre Lieve Vrouwe Brokenskap, and anybody who can correct that for me, well, guess what? I know two languages, English and bad English. Actually, I can fledgling do about 6 languages, but that's neither here nor there. It was considered a religious confraternity with origins around the early 1300s in Bosch's hometown to promote the veneration of the Mother of God. It originally was organized around carved members and sworn members because they used to donate a swan for the yearly banquet. Sworn members were mostly clerics and principal. However, they were often chose among nobility, magistrates, which also is what allowed Bosch to take on a lot more of his more interesting approaches to art, especially since this meant that there was an additional amount of funding available to him that would allow him to, again, go into nightmare fuel territory versus what the other more classic religious iconography had depicted at that particular time.
It is easier to get away with doing stranger and weirder things with your art, especially in times like those when you have friends who have a lot of money and power.
Yeah, it probably also prevented him from getting dubbed a heretic as well.
Very likely, yes. Because also I would imagine that most likely his patrons would be able to explain how, oh, this isn't heretical because this. They would have the ability and knowledge to come up with explanations that would please the people who would probably call Bosch a heretic.
Exactly, and definitely some of his work on the surface still holds to a lot of those classical religious ideals, but once you start to dig into it and see things how Bosch would have seen them, you get the feeling that, much like some of the more modern takes on how Bosch's work would be influenced, that shiny veneer underneath is nightmare fuel.
So what else do we know about Bosch?
Those are some of his more major historical markers. The fact is that he does actually continue to make his primary medium is he always worked in these incredibly large triptychs, or at least some of his more notable works were. The three that I had kind of chosen for this particular talk, of course, would be the Garden of Earthly Delights, which I have seen in person, and it is bloody huge. I believe the Garden of Earthly Delights measured, it is oil, of course. At the time, oil painting was still the primary method of these larger pieces. Frescoes were starting to die out at this particular time, but oil painting was still one of the more expensive mediums at the time, which was why Bosch was able to get away with this due to his connection of the Order of the Blessed Lady.
Also, I would imagine that would be kind of like a status symbol for the people commissioning it as well. If they are commissioning these large works or financially supporting these large works of art done in a more expensive medium, then yeah, it's a bit of a status symbol.
Exactly, and in the case of the Garden of Earthly Delights, it measures 81 inches by 152 inches.
That's big.
Yeah, that's over 12 feet in height.
Imagine having the money to pay someone to do that big of an art project, that large of a painting in triptych, in one of the more expensive mediums that was available at the time. And it just having that space, like, where would you even put that? These would obviously be in public places unless they're being done for someone who is insanely rich. In that case, it would probably still be in a public place, because why not show off, look how much money I have that was able to pay to get this work done?
Exactly, and in this particular case, it was displayed in a cathedral at the time. However, now it is displayed in the Museum del Prado in Madrid, Spain.
It's also very busy painting, from what I can see.
Oh, incredibly. And the idea with these triptychs is they are intended to tell a story. While they're closed, there's often more of a simplistic design on the outside. And then when you open it up, it is literally a story in 3 panels.
Which is something I admire as a storyteller. I may not have art skills, but the amount of time and dedication and thought that goes into telling a story visually, even with that much space, but to tell something cohesive, that has to take a lot of skill.
Most definitely, and with Bosch, he was known for creating very careful underpaintings as well beforehand. In the case of this particular, the Garden of Earthly Delights, the exterior panels, when closed, showed the world during creation. The general consensus is after the third day, after the addition of plant life, but before the appearance of humans and animals, which is interesting considering it quite literally is the before and after of once it's opened.
True, yeah.
And as a fun fact, in comparison to modern day costs of oil paint, the largest I've ever painted on was a 6 foot by 6 foot canvas, and that probably still cost me several $100s just in supplies alone, not counting time. So the fact is that with Bosch painting a literal 12-foot canvas, wow.
Had to take probably months, and he's done multiple triptychs from what I can see. Guess it was a different time back then. Didn't have as many things to worry about. If you were lucky enough to have a patron to pay to support your art, there's a reason there's such amazing art that came from those time periods. The world was a lot quieter. If it's very different kind of very chaotic. Not saying those were boring times, it was just a very different flavor of chaos and stress.
Definitely, and in the case of Bosch, he was given a lot more rein to question what he saw around him, which in his case definitely was advantageous.
That's something a lot of people can get away with, especially I would imagine during that time period.
Yeah, they were more of the burn as a heretic first and question later.
He was someone with a lot of talent and a lot of dreams who was in the right place at the right time.
Exactly. The techniques Bosch had used in this as well, one of the earlier known techniques of oil painting is called grisaille, which is a more grayscale version of the final painting, which is then, once the grayscale is created, he would then glaze over with layer after layer of oil paints that were usually diluted with linseed oil. It helps create a more vibrant contrast in the final piece, especially on wooden canvases or wooden mediums. Now, to further expand on the Garden of Earthly Delights, of course, it is interesting because Bosch continues to tell his stories. This one is, of course, 3 panels. Opening through it is basically a portrayal of 3 different realms. Paradise, Earth's pleasure, and, of course, the consequences, or at least at that time, hell. On the left-hand side, you get to see Eden, where a youthful Christ presents Eve to Adam. But even if you look closer, this is where Bosch's ability to have that shiny, beautiful veneer containing these unsettling elements, such as the cat walking away with a mouse in its mouth, strange creatures starting to kind of emerge and be portrayed around the lake. It's Eden, but underneath is a warning from Bosch. Of course, the central panel is where his imagination truly gets to be interesting. Dozens of nude figures cavort in a landscape with these fantastic yet unbelievable sculptures, as well as, of course, the emergence of Bosch's love for hybrid creatures. Giant birds are carrying people through the air, oversized fruits house secret ceremonies. Every bit of this tells a story, and this is also kind of what pulls into the open world game that draw inspirations such as Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and of course Elden Ring.
So I wasn't imagining those are giant blueberries in the back, or are those statues?
Those are giant blueberries.
Okay, sure, why not? No, I want blueberries.
Which, yeah, and if you zoom in, you can kind of see some of these ceremonies going on.
Trying to think of the amount of time it would take to not only just do the grayscale version of this, but to add in the layers of color. Like you say, it is very vibrant. The colors are very bold in some places.
Exactly.
Also, I keep getting distracted by the right panel where it kind of looks like a hollowed out person that's been bent in half.
Yep, and the right is where Bosch proves that there is no good endings, and also probably this is where most people would see the beginnings of Dark Souls and Bloodborne, the Fall of Paradise, the punishment that was associated with it back then, where these figures, well, let's just go with they got the bad ending side. The hybrid versions of these creatures are much more distorted, much more alien, which is what does lead into kind of the ideas for Geiger, as well as several of the Soulsborne games, which do have that same alien disfiguration of these creatures, especially with Bloodborne, where the religious iconography resulting in the creation of monsters takes a lot more of a front row seat.
I do believe I see a frog person eating someone in a very tall chair. And I think I also spot up near the top, is that an ear holding a knife?
Yep. The generalized theory of the ear holding the knife is secrets pierce the mind.
Yeah, it's always interesting seeing how people visually represent different ideas.
Yeah.
Especially such as that one back when it was a lot easier to keep secrets. But also there's an ear holding a giant knife. I find that amusing.
I just have nightmares of ear piercings. The other kind of reason for some of the more eldritch and nightmarish versions of figures and these creatures on the right panel also is what leads into the idea of knowledge sometimes bringing these eldritch truths to light, such as, well, you know what hell is, you're going to get a front row seat of it. That the idea of knowledge can corrupt or pervade in that time still sort of carries over to nowadays, which is both fascinating and only slightly disturbing.
Yeah, it's especially common in horror, where if you look too deep into the void will look back. It's also like the meme, knowledge is power, power corrupts, study hard, be evil.
Or absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
That it does, and it's less about having the knowledge and more of what do you do with that knowledge. Because some people use it to twist things.
Oh, most definitely, and considering the religious fervor that existed back then, you could tell that there was probably some people used Bosch's paintings to send a message, and Bosch may or may not have actually believed in that message himself.
I mean, with a good enough argument, you can twist a lot of things because art is subjective. Things that we talk about in the writing community is a lot of times people will read or see what they need to see from that. Which sometimes that can be a good thing, but sometimes people can use that to twist and mislead.
Somehow that just makes 50 Shades of Grey make a lot more sense in new and horrible ways.
Yeah, let's not get into the Twilight fanfiction, please.
I feel Bosch would have had a lot more fun with that than anybody else did for the cover art.
I don't even know where to begin with imagining that, but I want to see that now. I both really want to see that and am kind of afraid. Hey listeners, if you want to test your art skills and attempt to come up with what Hieronymus Bosch might have done if he were asked to do the cover art for 50 Shades of Grey, maybe Kate shouldn't post that on social media, but I am very curious. As I was saying that, I was like, this is a dangerous ask.
One of the other things that is really worth noting on the Garden of Earthly Delights is, while it was hailed as religious iconography, Bosch's own response in there could be seen as trying to think of the best way of phrasing this here, that, well, it does actually represent Eden, Earth itself, and Hell. God appears as creator of humanity in the left hand, while consequences of their failure are shown on the right. But well, many other religious artists at the time would actually either have some type of iconography or symbolism to represent God even in the centralized panels. Bosch does not, which can be interpreted one of two ways in my idea, or my theory is the fact is that Bosch is saying, hey, free will is a thing. The other kind of view of that is Bosch's knowledge of free will leading to damnation. Both are widely versed theories. Personally, I go with free will, but that's just me.
Free will is definitely a thing that leads to choices which have consequences, but I'm one that likes to hold on to hope even when I'm remaining realistic about things, so it doesn't always have to lead there. It can, but it doesn't have to. And there is good, even in all the crazy.
Believe The Last of Us put it best: when trapped in the darkness, look to the light.
There's always a light, there's always a silver lining.
Exactly.
Stay tuned for more Bosch talk on An Unexpected Art Lesson.